Xavier Miles had never set foot in a courtroom before the day he was labeled a murderer. Troy Benson had only taken a short walk home the night he vanished forever. At just 19, he was already a familiar face in Falridge, volunteering at the library, running drills at the community basketball court, helping his mom with groceries every Sunday morning. He had no enemies, no scandals, no secrets, or so everyone thought. They said Ruben's testimony was credible. Pressure from local officials and the media was mounting. The town needed a resolution. The police presented circumstantial details as fact. It was just another small-town tragedy, buried under headlines and official statements. But what no one realized then was how much darker and deeper this story really went. A small scrape on Xavier's arm was framed as evidence of a fight. His silence during questioning was portrayed as guilt. And just like that, he was charged with murder. He'd been sober, they claimed, for 6 weeks and had no reason to lie. The arrest made headlines. Breaking case of missing teen, one paper read. But beneath the surface, something didn't sit right. On a damp September evening, Troy left basketball practice at the high school gym. He waved to his coach, slung his gym bag over his shoulder, and began the 10-minute walk home. But he never arrived. And Ruben Tully, a drug-addicted informant with a trail of lies, held the key to destroying them both. Panic gripped the town. For the first few days, volunteers combed the woods. Drones flew overhead. Sniffer dogs traced his scent halfway into a thicket before it vanished. Police questioned everyone close to him, but no leads emerged. There was no sign of struggle, no discarded phone, no blood, just absence. What began as a small-town tragedy would unravel into a national disgrace. A local drifter with a long history of drug offenses, Ruben claimed he saw Troy that night in the woods, arguing with another young man, Xavier Miles. Ruben said he didn't intervene but heard yelling and what sounded like a struggle. The police latched onto this quickly. Xavier had been suspended from school years before after a fight with Troy. No one remembered why. Rumors began to swirl. The story twisted itself into something convenient. Xavier had a temper, a grudge, and now Troy was gone. Exposing a justice system so broken, it punished the innocent, protected the corrupt, and buried the truth beneath years of silence. This is the story of how the whole criminal justice system was not just flawed, it was shot. Troy Benson had always been the kind of kid who made life in a quiet town feel a little brighter. By morning, his mother reported him missing. Then, a man named Ruben Tully stepped forward. Without physical evidence or even a clear motive, the police arrested Xavier anyway. There was no forensic proof, no weapon, no body, but the system wanted closure. The case never reached the level of national attention. It was just another small-town tragedy, buried under headlines and official statements. But what no one realized then was how much darker and deeper this story really went. 2 years after Troy Benson's disappearance and Xavier Miles' conviction, most of Falridge had moved on. The case had become a closed chapter in the town's history. There were no fingerprints, no confirmed sightings of Troy after basketball practice, and nothing physically tying Xavier to any crime. The only real anchor to the prosecution's case was Ruben Tully's statement, one that, Jenna quickly realized, had never been thoroughly verified. He had worked as a confidential informant for the Falridge Sheriff's Department for years. His cooperation in other cases had also helped police close investigations quickly. Social media erupted with calls for the case to be reopened. Legal experts weighed in, calling it a textbook example of misconduct. Yet, despite growing pressure, the justice system remained silent. A construction crew clearing debris for a new park near Black Hollow Swamp struck something solid beneath layers of soil and concrete chunks. At first, they thought it was old piping, but the foul odor and odd shape of the wrapped material made them call authorities. When investigators unearthed the remains, dental records confirmed what many had feared, but no one had been able to prove Troy Benson had finally been found. Xavier remained in prison, labeled a killer. In some of those cases, convictions were made solely on his testimony, discussed only in whispers or brought up occasionally in crime podcasts that glossed over the details. But for Jenna Miles, a young journalist and podcaster obsessed with cold cases, the story felt unfinished. She stumbled upon the case during research for her series on wrongful convictions. Something about it felt too convenient, showing that Ruben's drug possession charges had been dropped just days after he gave his statement about Troy and Xavier. It appeared he had been rewarded for his information. Whether or not that information was true seemed less important to the authorities than the fact that it helped solve a high-profile case. Too clean. She filed a public records request to obtain the case files and court transcripts. What she received was shockingly thin. Jenna traveled to Falridge to investigate. The gas station near the edge of the woods, mentioned in the initial police report, still had archived surveillance footage from the night Troy vanished. The footage showed Ruben walking alone past the edge of the woods during the same time he claimed to see the supposed altercation. There was no sign of Troy or Xavier. The time stamp didn't even match Ruben's story. Digging further, Jenna uncovered a disturbing pattern. Ruben Tully wasn't just a random witness. Even more troubling was a leaked internal memo. Jenna began compiling her findings into episodes of her podcast. With each new detail, more listeners tuned in. Soon, the story gained traction beyond Falridge. And Troy? Still just a memory without a grave. Spring brought heavy rain to Falridge, and with it, an unexpected discovery that would blow the case wide open. A construction crew clearing debris for a new park near Black Hollow Swamp struck something solid beneath layers of soil and concrete chunks. At first, they thought it was old piping, but the foul odor and odd shape of the wrapped material made them call authorities. His remains were partially preserved, wrapped in a tarp, with signs of blunt force trauma to the skull and a fractured wrist. The coroner concluded he had likely died from repeated strikes to the head. DNA samples were collected from under his fingernails, and the results came back fast, a match to Ruben Tully. The wrongful conviction of Xavier Miles was no longer seen as a single misstep. It was the symptom of something much larger. A whistleblower from inside the Falridge Sheriff's Department leaked a cache of internal emails and documents to the press. What they revealed stunned the public. Ruben Tully hadn't just been used once or twice. He had been a routine tool in law enforcement's pocket, offering testimony in at least 8 separate cases over the previous 10 years. When investigators unearthed the remains, dental records confirmed what many had feared, but no one had been able to prove Troy Benson had finally been found. One entry, dated only weeks after Troy's disappearance, described a night of panic, a stupid fight, and someone who wouldn't stay quiet. While the entry didn't name Troy directly, it described the same wooded area near the swamp and a hastily buried secret beneath rocks and garbage. The implications were undeniable. The body had been buried beneath rubble in an area the original search teams never reached. The case, once assumed to be resolved, was now back in the spotlight. The sheriff's department, under new leadership since the last election, was forced to re-examine its own history. With Ruben Tully dead from an overdose months earlier, protests returned. People demanded accountability not just for Troy, but for every decision made to protect a false narrative. Yet behind closed doors, many of the same people who pushed that narrative were still in power, still collecting paychecks and still avoiding questions. The truth had finally come out, but it had taken a grave to bring it to light. He couldn't answer for anything, but the evidence he left behind spoke volumes. In his trailer, investigators found a water-stained journal. The sheriff's office released a brief statement acknowledging critical oversights in the original investigation. The district attorney's office dropped all charges against Xavier Miles, but the damage had already been done. Xavier had spent nearly 4 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He walked free with no formal apology, no restitution, and no answers to how such a catastrophic failure was allowed to happen. The town of Falridge erupted in frustration. As reporters and legal analysts dissected the reopened case, more cracks in the system began to show. The wrongful conviction of Xavier Miles was no longer seen as a single misstep. It was the symptom of something much larger. A whistleblower from inside the Falridge Sheriff's Department leaked a cache of internal emails and documents to the press, many of which followed a pattern: vague sightings, second-hand confessions, or overheard conversations, all uncorroborated, all treated as gospel. It found that surveillance footage was routinely deleted or left unlogged. Sheriff Mercer, now a state senator, denied wrongdoing and claimed ignorance. Though legally free, he remained trapped in the shadow of a lie. The justice system had admitted mistakes, but only after the damage had already been done. The district attorney declined to prosecute any officers. The town of Falridge looked the same on the surface: quiet streets, trim lawns, small town charm. But underneath, a bitter truth festered. Despite widespread outrage, investigations, and viral coverage, almost nothing had changed. The sheriff's department continued operating with the same core staff. Internal reforms were limited to procedural memos and half-day training sessions. No officers were fired. No one was charged with tampering evidence, falsifying reports, or covering up the wrongful imprisonment of Xavier Miles. Citing insufficient evidence of deliberate malice, the current sheriff issued a formal apology but called the scandal a legacy problem. Evidence kits sat unopened for months, and official logs were altered. In one instance, an officer manually changed the date on a witness report to make it fit a timeline. Investigators described the culture in the department as one that rewarded fast closures over accurate ones. In 5 of those cases, convictions were handed down without physical evidence, simply on Rubin's word. The leaked emails showed how officers had coordinated their reports around his statements, filling in gaps without ever checking facts. In one email, a deputy described Rubin as a shortcut with a mouth. What they revealed stunned the public. Rubin Tully hadn't just been used once or twice, he had been a routine tool in law enforcement's pocket, offering testimony in at least 8 separate cases over the previous 10 years. His name appeared repeatedly in incident reports. Xavier Miles, still investigating the wider story, uncovered that many of these cases were tied to the former sheriff, Dean Mercer. Mercer had built a career on high conviction rates, which he later used to campaign for a seat in the state Senate. His success, it seemed, was built on coerced narratives, cut corners, and informants like Rubin, who were protected from prosecution in exchange for helping close cases. A state-led audit of the Falridge Sheriff's Department followed. Despite the avalanche of proof, few consequences followed. Meanwhile, Xavier struggled to adjust to life outside prison. Employers saw his name and shut the door. Online databases still labeled him a murderer. 1 year after the discovery of Troy Benson's body, the town of Falridge looked the same on the surface: quiet streets, trimmed lawns, small-town charm. But underneath, a bitter truth festered. Despite widespread outrage, investigations, and viral coverage, almost nothing had changed. He applied for jobs, avoided reporters, and kept to himself. But the internet never forgets. A quick search of his birth name still pulled up old headlines, mugshots, and news clips labeling him a murderer. Her civil lawsuit against the sheriff's department was dismissed under qualified immunity. Her requests for further accountability were met with silence. She visited Troy's grave every week, her faith in justice shattered. But justice doesn't always follow. And in places like Falridge, where power protects itself, the cost of a mistake is paid not by those who make it but by those who live with its consequences forever. Background check companies listed his charge without the update that it had been dismissed. But the damage endured. The system had been exposed but not dismantled. Its flaws acknowledged but not repaired. Employers hesitated. Landlords declined. Even casual acquaintances eventually found out. He was free, but only in the legal sense. His life was permanently altered by a lie the system refused to fully correct. The sheriff's department continued operating with the same core staff. Internal reforms were limited to procedural memos and half-day training sessions. No officers were fired. No one was charged with tampering evidence, falsifying reports, or covering up the wrongful imprisonment of Xavier Miles. Xavier, now 25, tried to live quietly in a neighboring county under a different name. Xavier Miles released her final podcast episode on the case, titled "The Whole Criminal Justice System is Shot." In it, she didn't just talk about Troy or Xavier, she talked about all the others. The names buried in court records, the witnesses discredited or ignored, the slow erosion of public trust. The episode went viral. She appeared on talk shows, panel discussions, even testified before a state oversight committee. Politicians promised action, but as weeks turned into months, no new policies were passed. Troy's mother, once the heart of every protest and press conference, grew quiet. The scandal that once rocked Falridge slowly faded from the headlines. Another news cycle took its place. The podcast's momentum slowed. People moved on. For Xavier, for Troy's family, and for countless others across the country, the message was clear: the truth might surface. But justice doesn't always follow. And in places like Falridge, where power protects itself, the cost of a mistake is paid not by those who make it but by those who live with its consequences forever.